When I was a little girl, I was terrified of chickens. It seems that every time one of my relatives or friends invited me to their farm, they thought that a little town girl ought to get a taste of what it was like to live in the country. What better way than going to the chicken coop and gathering eggs? Have any of you done that? Yeah. It was awful. The minute the chicken coop door opened, the wings began to flap, the clucking began, and the air was all stirred up. It was from the straw, and it got into the air, and it got into my eyes and into my nose. Now, it was bad enough grabbing eggs from nests where there are no hens sitting. But moving a hen off the nest to take the eggs, no way, no way. Now, I didn't blame the hens. They were just protecting their eggs and trying to keep them warm until they were hatched into chicks. When the hens were left alone, they were calm, nurturing, and tender. But when they were threatened by a menacing fox or a little town girl, they became fierce and determined to protect those eggs. Now, mother hens are so fierce, in fact, that when their eggs or their chicks are in danger, they spread their wings, they gather their chicks underneath, and they leave themselves totally open and vulnerable for a fox's claws and their fangs. They will die for their chicks. Now, in today's gospel reading, we see both the fierce and the tender Jesus. He has been warned that a wily fox, Herod, is looking out for him, intent on doing him harm. Now, this is no idle threat. This Herod Antipas, is indeed the very same one who has recently beheaded Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. And yet, Jesus does not react in fear. It's more like batting away an annoying bug or a flea that buzzes by his ear. He has far more urgent things to do. More healing and more teaching has to be done before he completes his work on earth and before he goes for his final trip to Jerusalem. Today, tomorrow, and on the third day, he says, today, tomorrow, and the next day. A short time, just 3 days, and perhaps symbolic of a time it takes for completion or for fulfillment. And Jesus is fiercely determined to be about his business. This petty, sly fox is not going to deter him from that. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city of David, the center of Jewish identity, where the faithful come to celebrate their festivals and their holy days, and also a center of power and of division, not unlike what it is today. A city where prophets are killed. And yet here, we glimpse that tender Jesus, the mother hen lamenting over Jerusalem. It seems like a different voice, doesn't it? Not just the voice of the man Jesus going about his ministry, but the voice of God's word. The wisdom of God weeping for God's straying people who will not take refuge under his wings. Jesus weeps, not just for those who will reject him in the coming days, but for all of the people of Israel who were and are unfaithful, for all who were and are unwilling to accept God's invitation to gather beneath the protective wings, for those through the ages, in his presence and beyond, for people like you and like me. For our world rejects the invitation too. This week, we continue to look on with horror at the attacks on Ukraine, attacks on hospitals, on places of worship, and the mass evacuation of millions of people. Though it's spurred by nationalism, it is made even more distressing because at its core, it is a religious war, and Christians against Christians, like we've not seen perhaps since the 30 Years' War in Germany or the Civil War in England, or even way back to the Fourth Crusade. Jesus weeps. We also see here in our own country the residual, the persistent damage from hatred and fear of the other, of immigrants as invaders, of those forced into slavery or bondage, or forced from their homelands and their way of life, of those whose gender identity differs from the norm. We see violence for its own sake. Jesus weeps. Lack of basic civility, those who would rather confront disagreement with weapons than with dialogue, and those who feel excluded and oppressed. Jesus weeps. Now, I'm not suggesting that we be Christian doormats. It is possible to be both fierce and tender. Jesus showed us how. He even gave us a roadmap. His fierce, deep-rootedness in God's purpose and dream for humanity gave him his focus. His tender, deep compassion for God's people gave him the desire to protect and to stand with the least and the lost, and also to gather the scattered, the uncertain, whether it's those who actively refuse the invitation or do so because they feel unworthy or think that the promise is just too good to be true, or those who do not even know that there is a promise of shelter because they've been told and shown only exclusion and judgment and hatred. St. John's, you are doing such important work here. You are striving to live God's promise, and it shows. It shows when people who come to the door for the first time can see themselves in the diversity of this congregation. When worship is work of all of the people, not just the clergy or the professionals. When strangers are invited into this place, not to be indoctrinated, but to hear beautiful music, to share food and fellowship. When they see the community of faith at work in the neighborhood and in the world. This ordinary mother hen has shown us how to be followers of Jesus, to be fierce when it comes to respecting the dignity of all human beings, when it comes to loving God and neighbor. Being fierce doesn't mean using weapons or being hateful and cruel. It means supporting, speaking out, including, and weeping and being tender. Spreading our wings, not only to comfort and to shelter those who need protection, but to gather those who are scattered, to guide and strengthen those who are lost and in need of healing, to support one another in focusing on what is of the utmost importance, even when it's risky or scary or uncomfortable, even when the hen's feathery wings seem to be no match for the teeth and the claws of the fox. Maybe you are searching or wondering or wandering. I know that I am. There's always more to seek and to learn, but I've learned that we need not wonder or wander alone. If we are willing, we may gather together beneath the outstretched wings that have more than enough room for all the chicks, and maybe even some room for ducklings and geese. Amen.